The frontier town of Pine Hollow carried an air of dust and desperation. Its wooden storefronts leaned into the wind like weary travelers, and its single dirt road stretched beneath the sun in a haze of grit. On most days, the town square bustled with trading, gossip, and the faint clatter of wagons. But today, the crowd gathered for a darker spectacle, an auction that had nothing to do with cattle or tools. Jonas Hale, a lumberjack hardened by years of labor in the pine forests, stood at the edge of the gathering. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with hands scarred by axes and saws. His beard, streaked with gray, framed a face carved by silence and solitude. Jonas rarely came into town except for supplies, but whispers had reached even his ears. They're selling her. A woman. Masked. Shackled. As if she's less than human. Something in those whispers pulled him here, though he told himself it was only curiosity. Still, beneath the stern line of his jaw, there lingered a hollowness, a loneliness sharpened since the death of his wife 3 winters past. He raised 4 children in a cabin buried deep in the forest, yet nights were unbearably silent, and the weight of solitude pressed on him like the endless timber he hauled. The auctioneer's voice sliced through the air. "Step right up, folks. A chance you won't see again. A strong-bodied woman, capable of work, fit for service, or perhaps more, if the buyer so wishes." Gasps rippled through the crowd as 2 men dragged the figure forward. Her wrists were bound, her ankles tethered with rough rope, and over her head hung a coarse burlap sack. It sagged around her face, erasing identity, leaving only the outline of a person robbed of dignity. Murmurs surged like a rising tide. "Who is she? Why the sack? Heard she's been discarded, can't bear children." Jonas felt his chest tighten. He despised cruelty, and here it reeked. The woman's shoulders slumped in defeat, yet her posture carried a strange dignity, as though she clung to an invisible thread of strength. The auctioneer paced before her, slapping his palm with a cane. "Her parents brought her here, claimed she's of no use. Said she's barren, unfit for marriage. But look at her. Strong back, nimble hands. Who'll start the bidding? $10. Silence. Then a laugh. "Not for damaged goods." The crowd scorn thickened. Jonas watched the woman shift slightly, perhaps flinching, though the sack concealed her eyes. A flicker of shame burned in his gut. Not her shame, but the shame of everyone watching, himself included, for letting such a thing unfold. $5, the auctioneer pressed, his voice desperate. "Surely worth that." Another laugh. "You'd have to pay me to take her." Jonas clenched his jaw. He thought of his children, how Samuel, his eldest, had grown bitter without a mother's tenderness, how Clara longed for guidance, how little Thomas asked at night why the house felt so empty. He hadn't come here to find a wife, but perhaps, just perhaps, this woman needed saving as much as his family needed healing. $2, Jonas said. The word struck like a hammer. The crowd turned, disbelief painted on their faces. The auctioneer blinked, then smirked. $2? That's barely the worth of a good axe head. "No one else is bidding," Jonas replied, his voice steady, though his heart thumped. The auctioneer chuckled, raising his cane. "Sold. To the lumberjack in the back. May God have mercy on him." Laughter erupted, mingled with pity and scorn. Jonas ignored it. He stepped forward, pressing $2 silver into the auctioneer's palm. The metallic clink sounded like judgment itself. The woman was released into his custody with a shove. She stumbled, nearly falling, but Jonas caught her by the arm. Her skin was cold, fragile as frost. Without a word, he guided her away from the jeering crowd, leading her toward the stable where his horse waited. They walked in silence, the burlap sack still covering her head. Jonas felt the weight of stares, but he kept his back straight. Once they reached the outskirts of town, he paused. Gently, he reached for the knot binding the sack. "Let me," he said quietly. His fingers tugged the rope, loosening it until the sack slid free. For the first time, her face emerged into daylight. She was younger than he expected, no more than 20. Her hair, dark and tangled, fell over her shoulders. Her eyes, though rimmed with weariness, were striking, carrying a depth of sorrow that silenced him. She looked down, lips pressed tight, as if expecting ridicule. Jonas cleared his throat. "What's your name?" A long pause. Then softly, as though unused to speaking, "Eliza." The name drifted between them like a fragile bird. Jonas felt something shift inside him. Not pity, not obligation, but recognition. She was no longer the woman with the sack. She was Eliza, a person whose story stretched beyond this moment of humiliation. He nodded once. "Eliza, you'll ride with me." He helped her onto his horse, mounting behind her. As they rode toward the distant forest, the town shrank behind them, its laughter fading into the wind. Jonas glanced at the sack lying in the dirt road, abandoned. In that moment he knew, this was no purchase. It was a rescue, though he could not yet say whether it was for her or for himself. As the pine trees rose on the horizon, Jonas tightened his hold on the reins. The path ahead was uncertain, but his decision was made. Eliza was coming home. The road into the pines was not truly a road at all, but a narrow trail pressed by wagon wheels and horse hooves, swallowed by towering trees. The forest loomed vast and endless, its green canopy blotting out the sky, its air heavy with the scent of sap and damp earth. Jonas rode steadily, his frame upright, his grip firm on the reins, while Eliza sat in front of him, silent as stone. Every jolt of the horse's gait seemed to rattle through her thin frame, but she made no complaint. Behind them, Pine Hollow was only a memory, the crowd's laughter fading like smoke. Before them stretched Jonas's world, solitude, timber, and the labor of survival. By late afternoon, the trail widened into a clearing. There stood the Hale cabin, rough-hewn from logs Jonas himself had cut, its roof patched with pine shingles, its porch sagging yet sturdy. Smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the scent of stew and wood smoke. Children's voices drifted faintly, rising and falling in playful quarrel. Jonas slowed the horse. "Home," he said simply. Eliza stiffened. The word was foreign to her lips, almost unbearable. She had been stripped of hers the day her parents sold her, and now she was being brought into another against her will, or perhaps against her understanding. On the porch, a boy of 12 emerged first. Samuel, Jonas's eldest, stood with arms crossed, suspicion etched deep in his eyes. His face mirrored his father's, save for the rawness of youth. Behind him peeked Clara, 10 years old, her braids messy and her eyes wide with curiosity. And then little Thomas, barely 6, darted forward, barefoot and eager, his laughter echoing like a spark in dry grass. "Pa!" Thomas cried, rushing to the horse. "You're back. Who's that?" Eliza flinched under his gaze. Jonas dismounted, then helped her down. "This is Eliza," he said, his tone measured. "She'll be staying with us." Samuel's brow furrowed. "Staying? What for?" Jonas met his son's eyes with steady resolve. "Because I say so." The boy's lips pressed tight, but he said no more. Clara's gaze, however, softened as she studied Eliza. She tugged gently at the stranger's sleeve. "Are you hungry? We've got stew." Eliza blinked, caught between surprise and hesitation, then nodded faintly. It was the first kindness shown to her in weeks, perhaps months. Inside, the cabin was warm but worn. The single room bore marks of hard living. Tools stacked in corners, a quilt draped over the hearth, shelves lined with jars of preserves. The table bore scratches from years of meals and games. A loft above held straw mattresses where the children slept, while Jonas's own bed was tucked against the far wall. Eliza stood uncertain at the threshold, her hands trembling. She expected derision, commands, perhaps even cruelty. Instead, Jonas's voice broke the silence. "Sit, eat." He ladled stew into a bowl and placed it before her. The aroma of venison, potatoes, and onions rose warm and rich. Eliza lifted the spoon slowly, as though afraid it would be snatched away. The first bite burned her tongue, but she welcomed the heat. It reminded her she was still alive. The children watched her closely. Thomas whispered, "She eats funny." Jonas shot him a sharp look. "Mind your manners." Eliza lowered her eyes, cheeks burning, but she did not stop eating. Hunger overruled shame. That night, when the children settled in the loft, Jonas fetched a blanket and spread it across the small cot near the hearth. "You'll sleep here," he said. Eliza nodded, her throat tight. No sack over her head, no chains on her wrists. It was more mercy than she had dared hope for, though fear lingered. She wondered what Jonas expected in return, what price might come due. Jonas did not speak further. He banked the fire, then sat heavily in his chair, boots still on, eyes distant. His thoughts churned. He had brought a stranger into his home, into his children's lives. He barely knew her name, let alone her heart. Was this rescue or folly? Eliza lay awake long after the cabin grew quiet. Shadows of firelight danced across the rafters. She listened to the soft breathing of the children, the steady sigh of Jonas in his chair. For the first time in weeks, no jeering voices taunted her, no ropes bit her skin. Yet she felt no peace, only the weight of uncertainty. Morning came early, with roosters crowing and frost still silvering the grass. Jonas rose, his movements deliberate. He placed a kettle on the fire and poured water into a basin. Turning to Eliza, he said, "There's work to be done. You can choose what you take on, cooking, mending, tending the garden, or nothing, if you need rest. But under this roof, all contribute." His tone was firm but not unkind. Eliza met his gaze for the first time. His eyes were not cruel, nor calculating. They were weary, yes, but steady. She nodded once. "I can sew." And so her days in the cabin began. She mended torn shirts, patched trousers, and restitched quilts until her fingers ached. Clara often sat beside her, watching intently, asking questions about stitches. Thomas, too restless to sit still, brought her little treasures from the forest, pine cones, feathers, smooth stones. Only Samuel remained distant, watching with suspicion, as though waiting for her to prove unworthy. In the evenings, Eliza sat quietly at the table, listening. She rarely spoke, but she absorbed everything. The cadence of Jonas's voice, the laughter of Thomas, the shy curiosity in Clara's eyes, the silence of Samuel. Piece by piece, she began to map the contours of this family into which she had been thrust. Yet beneath her composure, conflict smoldered. She bore the wound of rejection, the stigma of infertility that had cost her her place in her parents' home. What would happen when Jonas discovered the same truth? Would she be cast out again? Or worse, used until discarded? The fear gnawed at her heart, even as she stitched her way into the fabric of the Hale household. Jonas, too, wrestled with conflict. At night, when the fire dwindled and his children slept, he studied Eliza in the dim glow. She moved with quiet grace, never demanding, never complaining. But there was distance in her eyes, a fortress built from pain. He wanted to ask about her past, but he refrained. He knew too well that some wounds bled when probed. As winter crept closer, the cabin filled with the sound of chopping wood, the scent of drying herbs, the laughter of children playing in the snow. And there, amid it all, stood Eliza, still silent, still uncertain, yet undeniably present. One evening, as Jonas stacked logs by the hearth, Clara tugged at his sleeve. "Pa," she whispered, glancing at Eliza. "Is she going to stay? Forever?" Jonas's hand stilled on the wood. He looked across the room at Eliza, who bent over her sewing, her dark hair falling loose around her face. She did not notice their gaze, lost in the rhythm of the needle. Jonas's answer was slow, deliberate. "That depends. On her. And on us." Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" "It means," Jonas said, his voice low, "a home isn't built in a day. It's built in trust." Eliza's hand trembled as she drew the needle through fabric. She had heard every word, and though her face betrayed nothing, her heart whispered a fragile truth. Trust was the one thing she feared to give, and the one thing she most longed to find. Snow lay thick over Pine Hollow, muffling the world in white silence. The cabin walls creaked beneath the weight of frost, and the pine trees stood like solemn sentinels, their branches heavy with ice. Winter in the mountains was unforgiving, demanding strength, patience, and unity. Inside, the fire crackled, but warmth alone could not melt the invisible wall between Eliza and the rest of the Hale family. She moved quietly from chore to chore, mending socks, stirring stew, or sweeping the wooden floor. The children had grown accustomed to her presence, yet a certain distance remained, as if she were a guest too temporary to truly belong. It was Samuel, the eldest, who sharpened that distance most. He watched her with suspicion. Every gesture weighed as if searching for fault. To him, she was not a mother, not yet, and perhaps never would be. She was a stranger thrust into their lives by his father's inexplicable choice. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the family huddled close to the fire, the unspoken finally found words. Samuel scowled as Eliza set a bowl of stew before him. "We don't even know who she is," he muttered, his voice low but sharp enough to cut the room. Jonas looked up from his chair. "Mind your tongue." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Why? You bought her like a sack of grain, and now she sits at our table. How do we know she's not just waiting to take what she can and run?" The word stung Eliza deeper than she let show. Her hand froze mid-motion, the spoon clattering softly into the pot. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Even Thomas stopped fidgeting, his wide eyes darting between his brother and Eliza. Jonas rose, his voice steady but fierce. "That's enough." But Eliza spoke before he could say more. Her voice was quiet, almost trembling, yet resolute. "He's right." The room stilled. Jonas's eyes narrowed, confusion flickering across his face. Samuel's expression hardened in vindication. Eliza folded her hands tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floorboards. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through, or what I've lost. You don't owe me trust, and I can't demand it. I only ask for the chance to earn it." Her words trembled like a fragile bridge stretched over a chasm. Jonas watched her, his jaw set, but something softened in his gaze. The children, too, seemed unsettled, caught between sympathy and doubt. That night, as the fire died down, Eliza lay on her cot near the hearth, sleep evading her. Samuel's accusation echoed in her mind. Though his words had been harsh, they carried truth. She was a stranger, and her silence had built walls as high as the pines outside. Trust could not grow in shadow. The next morning, she made a choice. When Jonas rose at dawn to fetch water, he found her already outside, her thin form bent beneath the weight of an axe nearly too large for her. She struggled, but she swung, splitting wood in awkward, uneven cuts. Jonas strode over, his voice sharp. "What are you doing?" "Helping," she said, breathless, gripping the axe with trembling hands. "You'll hurt yourself." He reached for the handle, but she pulled back. "I can learn," she insisted, her eyes fierce despite her trembling arms. "I won't just sit by the fire while everyone else works. I need to show," she faltered, then swallowed hard. "I need to show that I belong here." Jonas studied her for a long moment, the winter sun glinting off the frost in his beard. Then, without a word, he adjusted her grip on the axe, guiding her stance. "Feet apart. Swing from the shoulders, not the wrists." Together they split wood until the pile grew high. Her hands blistered, her muscles screamed, but she refused to stop. Samuel watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. Days turned into weeks, and Eliza threw herself into every task, hauling water, mending fences, feeding livestock, even trudging into the woods to help Jonas fell smaller trees. The children began to notice. Clara followed her like a shadow, eager to learn sewing stitches and cooking tricks. Thomas adored her, clinging to her skirts and begging for stories. Only Samuel remained distant. The breaking point came one evening when Thomas disappeared into the woods. Panic swept through the cabin like wildfire. Jonas grabbed his rifle, Samuel darted ahead with a lantern, and Eliza followed despite the biting cold. "Thomas!" Jonas's voice boomed into the trees, swallowed by the wind. It was Eliza who found him, huddled beneath a fallen pine, his cheeks red with cold, his small body shivering. She dropped to her knees, wrapping him in her shawl, pulling him close. "You're safe now," she whispered, rocking him against her chest. Jonas arrived moments later, relief flooding his features as he gathered his son into his arms. Samuel stood behind him, lantern shaking in his hand, his eyes locked on Eliza. For the first time, he saw not a stranger but a protector, someone who had stepped into the storm without hesitation. Back at the cabin, when Thomas was tucked beneath blankets by the fire, Samuel lingered by Eliza's cot. He shifted awkwardly, his voice low. "I was wrong about you." Eliza looked up, startled. His face was flushed, his eyes averted, but his words carried sincerity. "I don't know why Pa brought you here," Samuel admitted. "But tonight, I saw why you stayed." Her throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but emotion caught in her chest. She simply nodded, her eyes shining with unspoken relief. Jonas watched the exchange from across the room, his heart stirring in ways he had not allowed for years. He saw the fragile threads of trust weaving between his children and this woman who had entered their lives by chance, or perhaps by providence. Yet even as warmth began to grow within the cabin, shadows lingered. Eliza's secret weighed heavy, the truth of her infertility, the shame that had driven her from her family. She feared that once revealed, it would unravel all the fragile progress she had made. And Jonas, though grateful for her presence, wrestled with doubts of his own. Could trust born of necessity endure the trials of truth? Or would it, like wood under too much strain, splinter and break? As the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in silence, the Hale cabin stood at a crossroads, its walls filled with warmth, but its foundations still fragile. Trust had begun to grow, but trust, like timber, could splinter under pressure. And winter had only just begun. Spring came late to Pine Hollow. The snow melted reluctantly, revealing patches of stubborn earth beneath. Streams, once frozen and silent, gurgled with new life, and buds appeared on the pines like shy promises. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere, too, began to change. The long winter had forged something fragile but real between Eliza, Jonas, and the children. Eliza stood at the window one morning, watching the mist lift from the trees. The children's laughter echoed outside as Clara and Thomas chased each other around the yard, their boots splashing in thawed puddles. Samuel was with Jonas, repairing a fence weakened by heavy snow. Her hands rested on the windowsill, but her heart was restless. She had found warmth, acceptance, perhaps even belonging in this cabin of pine and stone, but she knew the truth still lingered like a shadow. The trust she had gained might fracture when it was revealed. That evening, as the fire painted the walls in golden hues, Eliza sat with the children, teaching Clara a new embroidery stitch. Jonas returned from outside, shoulders weary from labor, his presence filling the room with a quiet strength. He watched Eliza with his daughter, the gentle curve of her smile, the patience in her hands, and he felt a stirring he had long buried. Later, when the children were asleep, he lingered by the hearth with her. Silence stretched between them, thick but not uncomfortable. He finally spoke, his voice low. "You've changed this place," he said. Eliza looked up, startled. "Changed it?" He nodded, eyes fixed on the fire. "Before you, this cabin was just wood and stone. We lived, but we didn't live. Now there's laughter again. There's warmth." He paused, glancing at her. "You've given my children something I thought they'd lost forever." Her breath caught, her heart aching with both joy and dread. She longed to tell him the truth, to confess the burden she carried, but fear held her tongue. Days turned into weeks, and the thaw gave way to true spring. Jonas took her into the woods often, showing her where wild herbs grew, teaching her how to recognize animal tracks. She listened intently, eager to learn, and slowly the silence between them grew softer, filled with unspoken understanding. Yet the secret gnawed at her. One evening, as the family gathered for supper, the conversation turned unexpectedly sharp. Clara, ever curious, asked a question that hung over Eliza like a storm cloud. "Papa," Clara said, spoon clutched in her small hand, "will Eliza give us a new baby one day?" The room froze. Jonas's eyes widened, Samuel looked away, and Thomas giggled, not understanding. Eliza's hands trembled. She could not bear the silence that followed. Setting down her spoon, she forced herself to meet their gazes. Her voice shook, but it carried the weight of truth. "No," she whispered, "I cannot bear children." The words hung heavy in the room. Clara's brow furrowed in confusion. Samuel's mouth opened, then closed, his expression conflicted. Jonas's jaw tightened, his face unreadable. Eliza's heart pounded, her chest tightening with shame. It is why my parents sold me. They thought me worthless because of it. Her eyes dropped, tears burning. I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid. Afraid of losing the place I've found here. Silence roared louder than any storm. Finally, Jonas pushed back his chair and stood. Eliza braced herself for anger, for rejection, for the shattering of all she had built. But instead, Jonas moved around the table and knelt beside her. His hand, rough with calluses, reached for hers. You think being unable to bear children makes you worthless? His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with intensity. Eliza, look at what you've done. You've mended torn clothes, filled this home with warmth, brought laughter back to my children, and risked your life for Thomas. You've given us more than I ever hoped for. Her tears spilled, hot and unrestrained. Jonas's hand tightened around hers. You're no less a woman because of what you cannot give, he continued. You are more because of what you choose to give, and you've given us love. Clara slid from her chair and wrapped her arms around Eliza's waist. You're already like a mama to me, she whispered. Thomas clambered onto her lap, his small hands patting her cheeks. Even Samuel, though silent, nodded faintly, his expression softening with acceptance. Eliza's sobs broke into a laugh of relief, the weight of years of shame lifting at last. From that night forward, something shifted permanently. The secret no longer separated them. Instead, it bound them closer, the truth a root that deepened rather than weakened their bond. As spring ripened into summer, the cabin transformed. Eliza planted a small garden, coaxing herbs and vegetables from the soil. Jonas built a new cradle, not for a baby of their own, but for Clara's dolls and Thomas's toys, a symbol that family was not defined by blood alone. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the forest in gold, Jonas took Eliza's hand and led her to the edge of the clearing. The pines swayed above, their needles whispering in the breeze. He stopped, turned to her, and with a quiet reverence said, Eliza, I've spent years living with loss. I thought love was something I'd buried with my wife. But you've shown me it can grow again, even in rocky soil. I don't want just someone to keep my house. I want you. Will you stand by me, not as a bargain, not as a duty, but as my wife? Her breath caught, her heart thundering. She searched his face, saw the sincerity etched in every line, and felt her fear dissolve into certainty. Yes, she whispered, tears shimmering in her eyes. Yes, I will. The kiss they shared beneath the pines was not fiery or rushed but steady, grounded, like roots sinking deep into the earth. It was the kiss of two souls who had weathered storms, who had learned that love was not born of perfection but of persistence, sacrifice, and truth. In the months that followed, the Hale family thrived. Eliza, once a woman sold into silence, now stood as the heart of a home filled with laughter and love. The children no longer saw her as a stranger, but as the mother they had longed for. Samuel, once wary, often sought her counsel, and Clara clung to her like a shadow. And Jonas, lonely no more, found in her a partner, someone who shared his burdens, lightened his days, and rooted his family in hope. The roots of love had taken hold, not fragile or fleeting, but strong enough to withstand whatever storms might come. For love, once planted in truth, grew deeper than any wound and stronger than any past.